So now let me talk about the United Kingdom, which is very much similar to what is done in France. So the UK has an organization called NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And this is an organization that actually has no regulatory authority whatsoever. They do one thing only. They provide recommendations on whether or not certain kinds of therapies should be recommended given the price and the indication. And they are a consulting arm to the National Health Service, who does have the responsibility to make the decision. And so this is a document on the NICE website about what their guidelines are, and they take really seriously their role to make these decisions about costs and benefits. And they actually have a social value judgment principles for the development of NICE guidance that describes how they make their decisions. And they have principles here, the principles of bioethics. They look at different kinds of justice systems, utilitarian arguments versus egalitarian arguments, and they come down to something that they call procedural justice, which basically says they're going to try to be as transparent as possible, and if they make a mistake, they're happy to talk about it. Let's get all the stakeholders together and try to discuss this in a rational fashion. So here is their guidance for Sovaldi. Sovaldi, they determined, is recommended for certain kinds of indications and in certain combinations. But in other cases, it is not recommended. And so they make very clear what is cost effective versus not. And this document is like a 150-page report. They actually go through all of the analysis and are totally transparent about how they're making their recommendation. And so they recommend, in certain cases, yes, the government will pay for Sovaldi. In other cases, they will not pay for Sovaldi. And they've got a nice website where you can actually see for different conditions, like liver conditions. You can go down this flow chart and ask the question, what kind of treatments are allowed and what kind aren't and why. All of it is totally transparent, not necessarily all that easy to understand if you're not an economist, but at least it's out there for everybody to see. Okay? So that's the good stuff. Let me talk about the bad stuff. So NICE, at one point, was asked to evaluate a particular cancer drug known as Kadcyla. This is a breast cancer drug. And it's a drug that doesn't cure the disease, but it does slow it down. It gives you an incremental 9 months of life. And so the drug is approved in the United States, and it was put in front of NICE, and NICE said at 90,000 pounds a year for this drug, no, well, I don't recommend it. And they gave a lot of reasons for it, but the bottom line is this is not recommended. Okay? And so the headlines of the newspaper that day when the judgment came out was breast cancer drug is rejected for the National Health Service use on cost-benefit grounds. Charities angered by guidance on Kadcyla, which costs 90,000 pounds per year and gives an extra 9 months on average. Okay, so you tell me, is that a good decision? You agree with that? 9 months, Madeline?
Because I'm coming from the person who gave all the utilitarian responses earlier. But I think that the way that I view this that makes this feel okay to me is that if insurance is paying less for something like this, but it means that everyone can have health care, that is a gain that's worth it. And maybe we're asking the 10 lives versus 1 life question, but not really, because here the patient still dies in 9 months, and perhaps that $90,000 or pounds is better, sent to do mammograms to catch breast cancer earlier, then you have fewer patients who even get to that stage and need it. So from my perspective, yeah, it feels harsh to put it in terms like this, but I think it's reasonable.
Right. So that was exactly the kind of logic that NICE came to. By looking at what you could do with 90,000 pounds a year across the patients that would take this drug, how much good you could do for the entire society. So now let me ask you how you feel if it was your mother or your sister or your daughter that had breast cancer, and this will give you an extra 9 months with them. It's not so easy. If it's your family member, it's 9 extra months. 9 months, that's a lot of time. for 90,000 pounds. Now, I'm not disputing your view. It's a view that I share as an economist, but you're talking about people here, and you're talking about me hurt you. That narrative is pretty clear. It's very, very hard to do that. So, yeah.
I'm just curious, I mean, you could still pay for this out of pocket, so
Well,
in theory, I mean, I understand that it's
you
very
can pay it,
expensive.
and I can pay,
Right.
but there are people that cannot pay.
One can pay.
Yeah.
So could you not pair that with, I mean, obviously the healthcare loans, securitized healthcare loans is not a thing right now, but like,
Right.
could you not pair this with that because
Right.
that's what you can get the best of both worlds?
So that's exactly the hope. We need better financing to deal with some of these issues so that we can allow consumers to make those kind of choices. But if you propose this in this country, you know what the reaction is going to be. You've already heard it. These are called death panels. And as soon as you use that word, now I'm not taking any sides on politics. I believe that up until now, none of you has any idea what my political affiliation is, and that's the way it should stay. But the point is that it has been used in the debate about healthcare because we don't have a single-payer healthcare system. We like competition in this country, and to start enforcing this and not allowing patients to have access to 9 extra months of life for a mere 90,000 pounds. That's the rhetoric that you can easily see taking over the narrative. Yeah.
It's been very gratifying to see the public discourse about the details of healthcare costs. But the truth is, these decisions have already been made for a long time, but they've been made passively. Now it's been being brought into the spotlight, which is good.
Yeah.
But it's really an issue of the social contract between the individual and the government.
Right.
This is less of a moral issue than one about the social contract.
Absolutely. But if you want to start rejiggering the social contract, somebody has to take responsibility for that rejiggering. Who would like to start? Anybody? Who would like to be in charge of death panels? It's a political hot potato. And not only that, imagine in this country if somebody proposed an idea like this, and now I'm an aspiring young politician, and I see an opportunity. Hey, you're going to let these people take away your mother's treatment, your sister's treatment, vote for me, and I will make sure that we kill this. It's really hard to do something like this in this country. Yes?
I'm afraid we're taking a much too simplistic look at this by giving it a binary choice between if this were your mother, what would this look like versus not. And I think it's much more complicated when you look at all of the payers. If we're thinking about pharmaceuticals and the technology inputs into the total cost of healthcare, those are the largest driving factors to the increasing cost of healthcare, which then raises the cost for all, which then raises healthcare costs, which then individuals must pay more for, which then means that more individuals, as we're potentially are changing a healthcare system, are not going to be able to have access to healthcare.
Right.
So then that $90,000 is going to look much different. And so I think this is the easiest way to look at it.
Right.
But it is not the best way to look at it, and it does not bring us, I think, further into the mix of what policymakers and everyone is looking at.
I could not agree with you more. That was extremely well said, and what you said was very similar to what Madeline had pointed out. Think about how that will play on the 6 o'clock news. Right, that's the problem. The narrative...
Us to learn how to consider
Absolutely.
beyond the 6
That's right. And it's up to us to figure out how to develop a narrative that people can understand that actually is consistent with the right kinds of decisions, if there is such a thing as the right kind of decisions. That gets back to the social contract. Are we talking about the greatest good for the greatest number, or are we talking about equal access for everybody? We need to decide, and those are the tough decisions that right now our politicians aren't doing, but in France, in the UK, they've made these decisions and they live with them. But somebody at some point had to make that decision and renegotiate the social contract. Yes?
I was going to say that one additional benefit of making this social contract is also that
Yes.
It's also because of this free market that prices are so high. So you would also give leverage to even increase the effect of more benefits for more people.
There's no doubt, absolutely. With a single payer system, we know that prices will come down because you've actually reduced the risk and leveled the playing field. But how do we get there from here? That's the challenge, and we have to come up with better narratives. So why don't we have a NICE in the US? That would be a start to be able to do the chain of logic that Jessica suggested. You need to come up with measures. And I'll tell you, we do have a NICE in the United States, sort of, which is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. So fortunately, we have a representative, Bill Dreitland, who's going to be speaking a little bit later on, and we're going to be able to find out a little bit more about what ICER does. ICER does not have the same standing yet as NICE in the UK. But what it's doing is very much along the same lines of developing rational analysis to try to balance all of these considerations, including impact on budgets, which NICE does not necessarily do because it's a single payer system. But here in the US, we actually have a multi-payer system, and so the impact on a local payer's budget actually matters a lot. And that's something that NICE is willing to take on, that the ICER is willing to take on, that NICE doesn't have to.